What's up, y'all? Professor Hurley here with another episode of Purple Bear Biology. If you're new to the channel, check out some of the other awesome videos and subscribe so that you never miss a conversation. This episode is going to discuss the autonomic nervous system. Our autonomic nervous system is also known as our visceral motor division of the peripheral nervous system and is a vital connection between our nervous system and homeostatic regulation. First, we're going to discuss the basic structure of our autonomic nervous system, and then we're going to discuss how it influences different tissues throughout our body. First, recall that our nervous system can be broken down into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system can then be subdivided into sensory and motor divisions. Now, we can further divide our autonomic division, or the visceral motor division, into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. I want, when you hear these divisions, for your brain to automatically associate what their effects are on the body. Always remember that our sympathetic division prepares us for fight or flight responses, while our parasympathetic division sets our body up for a rest and digest. Sympathetic stimulation occurs when our body is going through something that is energetically demanding, like going for a run. The sympathetic division can also be activated when somebody is upset or angry. In contrast, the parasympathetic division regulates the body into a condition for gathering and storing energy, as well as stabilizing for homeostasis during inactivity. We will talk more about these responses in a second, but first let's take a look at the cellular structure of these two divisions. Branching off of the spinal nerves, the sympathetic and parasympathetic neural pathways involve two neurons, preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons. This is in contrast to our somatic motor neurons that we are accustomed to with skeletal muscle contraction, where one myelinated neuron fiber connects at the neuromuscular junction to a muscle cell. Structurally, the neurons differ between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. The sympathetic neuron pair have a short preganglionic neuron and a long postganglionic neuron. However, the structure is reversed for the parasympathetic system, with a long preganglionic neuron and a short postganglionic neuron. Despite some arrangement differences, all of these neurons have one thing in common. They use neurotransmitters to communicate with one another. Recall from our previous conversation about neurotransmitters and protein receptors at the neuromuscular junction that these two things act a lot like locks and keys, where neurotransmitters have specific receptors they can bind to. Our body can vary responses to different environmental stimuli by activating different neurons that release different neurotransmitters, which in turn bind to their associated receptors on target tissues. We will focus on three main neurotransmitters: acetylcholine, which we have discussed in our muscle contraction conversations, and epinephrine coupled with norepinephrine. Collectively, the last two both bind to the same receptors, so we tend to consider them together. You've probably heard of epinephrine before, though you didn't know it. It's your body's adrenaline chemical. Each of these neurotransmitters can bind to either adrenergic receptors for our adrenaline neurotransmitters or cholinergic receptors for our acetylcholine. Technically speaking, acetylcholine can bind to two types of cholinergic receptors: nicotinic receptors found in places like the neuromuscular junction, and muscarinic receptors found on our sweat glands. Okay, so now that you have some idea of the nerve structure and chemicals that these two different divisions of our peripheral nervous system utilize, let's compare the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic neurotransmitters to receptor relationship to see how one gets activated and has targeted responses. Let's start with the sympathetic nervous system. We have preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons that connect to three different targets, either target tissues all over the body, including things like the eyes, the heart, and even the digestive system. They can also attach to sweat glands or to the adrenal medulla gland that is actually found on the superior portion of your kidney. All preganglionic neurons are releasing acetylcholine and have receptors that fall into one large category of receptors called cholinergic receptors. As I said before, there are two basic types of cholinergic receptors: muscarinic and nicotinic. Nicotinic receptors are found on the postganglionic neurons and the adrenal medulla. These are the same receptors found at the neuromuscular junction as well. Postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system release epinephrine or norepinephrine neurotransmitters at target tissues. And this neurotransmitter binds to a new type of receptor called the adrenergic receptor. This causes the fight or flight response. At the sweat glands, ACH still gets released, but now it binds to muscarinic receptors to stimulate sweat secretion. The last interaction is between preganglionic neurons and the adrenal medulla, where ACH binds to nicotinic receptors and stimulates the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream to create a systemic fight or flight response. In comparison, the parasympathetic division is much more simplistic. Like the sympathetic division, preganglionic neurons release ACH that binds to nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic neurons. These postganglionic neurons release ACH that binds to muscarinic receptors on the target tissues. Initially, this may all sound confusing, but remember that the body differs which system it activates depending on what response is needed. Ultimately, having different neurotransmitters, like epinephrine and norepinephrine, that bind with adrenergic receptors for the sympathetic division, and ACH with muscarinic receptors for the parasympathetic division, enable us to differentiate which portion of our peripheral nervous system gets activated. So now that we have some idea of how our body activates these different neurons, let's discuss the effects on different tissues. To do this, it's easiest to draw it out using a table. This column will represent our target tissues, and these two columns will represent the effects when either the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system gets activated. Remember that the sympathetic nervous system stimulates a fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system is what our body would activate to stimulate rest and digest responses. Let's start with our sympathetic nervous system's effects. The way I like to think of this is a bear attack. Imagine you're walking down a hiking trail in Arkansas and you come across a black bear on the path. Your body must determine what needs to happen for you to either fight the bear off or run away as fast as you can. So let's take a look at the target tissues to see what happens. Starting with the eyes. Our sympathetic nervous system wants to enable us to see as much around us as possible, so the neurons cause pupil dilation. This enables us to have better vision and see better in dim light. Next, let's look at the heart. So our fight or flight response is going to increase our heart rate as well as increase the force of contraction, how hard the heart is beating. To run from our bear, we want to have plenty of oxygen. So now let's look at our effect on our lungs. We get something called bronchodilation. Bronchodilation occurs when the bronchial tubes that lead into our lungs expand, allowing air to more easily enter into the lungs. In addition to all of these, if we decide that we're going to run or fight, our body temperature is probably going to elevate. And so our sympathetic nervous system will want to regulate this by secreting sweat from our sweat glands. The last two things that I want to discuss are the blood vessels to the muscles. So if we want to run away from a bear, we want plenty of oxygenated blood going to our muscles. So we get dilation of our blood vessels. This is also called vasodilation. And then blood vessels to the digestive system. We don't really want to digest our breakfast if we're trying to fight off or run from a bear. So we get constriction of the blood vessels to our digestive system. This is called vasoconstriction. Okay, now let's think of this from the parasympathetic side. Now we are not running from a bear. Instead, we're watching a documentary on how paper is made on Netflix while eating some popcorn. This would stimulate a rest and digest response. So let's think about how this would affect target tissues. In almost all cases, the parasympathetic nervous system will have the opposite effect. So for our eyes, we'll get pupil constriction. For our heart rate will go down. For our lungs, we'll get bronchial constriction because we don't need the bronchial pathways to be wide for air to travel as easily. But when we get to our sweat glands, remember that it's our sympathetic nervous system that has a connection to them. Our parasympathetic actually doesn't innervate our sweat glands, so it has no effect. The same can be said for our skeletal muscles. Our sympathetic nervous system has a direct connection, but our parasympathetic system has no effect. Now, the blood vessels that go to our digestive system are important for nutrient absorption, and so if we're in a rest and digest state, then we would want to dilate or vasodilate the blood vessels that lead to our digestive organs. And like I said before, there's sphincter muscles that wrap around the passageways to each of our digestive chambers. These would relax if our parasympathetic nervous system was activating them. You can see that the responses from these two systems tend to be antagonistic of one another. Many tissues have what we call dual innervation, meaning both divisions of the autonomic nervous system connect to them. The degree to which one division controls tissues over another is referred to as autonomic tone. Despite dual innervation, the sympathetic system tends to have a stronger autonomic tone over blood vessels, and the parasympathetic division dominates the heart rate, regulating it to about 72 beats per minute. Aren't our autonomics awesome? Hopefully you found this a useful way to explore the divisions of our autonomic nervous system, and now have a clearer understanding of how our body regulates systemic responses to environmental stimuli. If you liked the video, be sure to click the like button and drop a message below in the comment section if you have questions or would like future videos to explore some of this conversation in more detail. As always, I appreciate you watching. Thanks for stopping by, and see y'all next time.